Hello, my name is Denise Cole. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Maine in the Department of Natural Sciences, Forestry, and Agriculture. My capstone project was about assessing microplastic risks in Maine's agricultural systems. Last summer, I had the opportunity to work with PhD student Rachel White on her research assessing gastropods, such as snails and slugs, as parasite vectors for livestock. While collecting and analyzing gastropods and fecal samples from 6 Maine farms for parasites, we found microplastics in them. There are 2 types of microplastics, primary and secondary. Primary microplastic is plastic that is initially fabricated small, such as microbeads in makeup products. Secondary microplastic is plastic that is shedding from other plastic products like tarps, bottles, or tires. It can also be sourced from plastic synthetic items like polyester. In the lab, we mostly found secondary microplastic fibers, which are most likely sourced from clothes and tarps. Looking at the snails and slugs, 22.72% of them were contaminated with microplastics, with there being more microplastics on average found in rotational fields than continuous fields. While over 3/4 of all gastropods do not contain microplastics, about 1 in 5 gastropods do contain microplastics. This does not accurately represent the spread of microplastics in these farm landscapes because this is only what was found incidentally through Rachel's research, but it does show that they are present in some capacity. Fecal samples of the 6 farms' animals, which included cows, alpacas, sheep, and goats, and visiting deer, which were assumed to be white-tailed deer due to it being the prevalent cervid species in this area, were also taken over the course of the summer. There was a total of 58 fecal samples collected, and 32 of them contained microplastics, or a 55.17% contamination rate. The fecal samples were processed in the lab using a Berryman method that was intended to collect parasites from the fecal samples. Larger microplastics may not have been found due to this extraction process. About half of the fecal samples from deer, sheep, and goats were contaminated with microplastics. The number of samples from cows and alpacas were small, 3 and 2 samples from each respectively, but microplastics were found in both species. Again, this experiment was not designed to look at microplastics directly, so there is much missing, and there could have been contamination in the laboratory processes, but it shows that microplastics are there. Because of the presence of microplastics in snails, deer, and livestock, I wanted to know what Maine farmers understand and think about microplastics. I created a survey to answer my questions. This was anonymous, but we did ask the respondents to say what county they were from, and we got at least 1 survey response from each Maine county. 98 farmers were surveyed in total. More than 200 responses are shown, since farmers often raise more than one type of animal or crop. From alpacas to yaks, Maine farmers host a diversity of species. I had thought that Maine farmers would be unaware of microplastics, but it turns out a large majority already knew what microplastics were before taking the survey. Today, microplastics have mostly been studied and discussed in the context of aquatic environments. Studying terrestrial microplastics is an emerging field. However, it is apparent that Maine farmers are pretty aware of emerging issues. Literature suggests that the more produce and meat move for sale, production, and processing, the higher risk of microplastic exposure. Maine does not seem to have a large issue with this. Most of the produce and meat are kept locally within the community, which reduces incidental microplastic exposure. Despite everyone's best efforts, litter and trash often blow onto farmers' property from the road and elsewhere. This is what the surveyed farmers said they typically find on their land. Farmers mentioned the effects of previous landowners' irresponsible waste disposal practices. These have negative impacts today as trash emerges from the ground or pollutes soil and water resources. So how do people think microplastics and other plastic waste get onto their land and in the environment? Surveyed farmers thought that weather events and people were the biggest culprits. While making the survey, I had not originally included weather as an option, but one of my friends suggested it while reading it over, and it turned out to be the most selected choice. 47 farmers said they themselves bring microplastics onto their farm. This could be from their clothes or other plastic items that they use. So I wanted to know how farmers use plastic in their day-to-day. Blue fibers are what we notice the most in the fecal samples and in the gastropods, which can probably be pointed to tarps. Everyone uses them, not just farmers, and you can see the strips of plastic that fall off as they degrade over time. Farmers also thought that packaging, plastic bags, and electric fencing could be shedding microplastics. Another source of microplastics could be from livestock feed. Almost half of the farmers said they found plastic items contaminating their livestock feed. Conversely, half did not find plastics in their feed, which may mean that it's not there, but it could also mean that we aren't looking closely enough. I myself have found food wrappers, zip ties, and other plastics in hay bales before. Along with Maine farmers' management practices involving plastic, I wanted to know the perceptions of microplastics. So I created questions with a table of statements where participants selected how strongly they agreed or disagreed with the statement. It appears that nobody thinks microplastics are great for the environment, but almost 5% think that they are not harmful. A small percentage of farmers also do not think that they pose a threat to their health. Farmers seem unsure about microplastic risk to their own health, but are more convinced that they aren't a good thing in their crops or livestock. A relatively higher proportion of farmers disagreed with beneficial effects of microplastics than agreed with negative effects of microplastics. The beneficial effects question followed by the negative effects question may have induced some reflection and opinion changes in the respondents. Then I wanted to know where farmers think the microplastics are in Maine. About 72% of farmers believe that there is an issue with microplastics in Maine, while only 30% of farmers say that they believe there is an issue with microplastics on their farm. Microplastics are often talked about in a marine setting, so these participants may not think that microplastics are as pervasive throughout the terrestrial environment as they are in aquatic environments. But it is also hard to admit that there might be an issue like this on your land. Something that is so unknown can be threatening and worrisome to think about, but there are aspects that landowners can control, and there are some aspects that Maine is already doing that are preventing more microplastic contamination. After taking the survey, participants have said that they would change their actions and have hopefully increased their understanding of microplastics. A small number of farmers were definitely not going to do most of the suggested items, but nobody was against every one of them. And while farmers were slightly negative or neutral about talking to each other about microplastics, a third were still probably or definitely going to do this, which could make a lot of difference to overall farmer awareness about plastic use. In contrast, well over half of the farmers were probably or definitely going to do the other suggested actions, including limiting use and using more caution with plastics on the farm. Taking the survey appears to have encouraged awareness and actions to decrease the occurrence of microplastics on Maine farms. And as ever, the farmers themselves are in charge of actual change. We hope to follow up with ongoing studies of this One Health and the environment concern in Maine. In conclusion, this survey raised farmer awareness of microplastics. It revealed that Maine farming is a local effort and that Maine farmers generally believe microplastics are harmful to the environment and one's health. External factors may impact microplastics on farms, but there are things that farmers have control over. Thank you to Dr. Ann Lichtenwallner, Rachel White, UMaine Cooperative Extension, REU, Lindsay Koyanagi, Kiana Dean, and Morgan Belvin. And thanks to NSF, REU, and SARE for funding. And thank you for listening.